Welcome, one and all, sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, to another one of my special wizard tales.
Frank Enstein. Late at night, in a dark alley where she didn't really belong, Channel 8 TV news researcher Libby Jansen was hard at work. A hot news story was breaking tomorrow. The Atlantic Corporation was about to unveil a revolutionary new car, and right now, Libby was investigating Atlantic's major competitor, Dr. Max Enstein. The alley cats scattered as Libby made her way to Dr. Enstein's darkened building. Just as she tried the locked front door, a voice rang out.
Now hold it right there, young lady.
Libby jumped with fright, but it was only the night watchman doing his rounds. The night watchman explained that the building was empty. Old Doc Enstein had closed the place a year ago. He also told Libby that Doc Enstein was crazy. This was intriguing.
What do you mean?
Inquired Libby. The night watchman told her that Enstein was a bit of an inventor. He claimed to have come up with a revolutionary new form of energy. And just before he was to announce it, all of his computer files were stolen. Everything. From that day, the old boy went batty. He closed down the business and just disappeared. With that, the night watchman gave a cheery wave and went on his way. A revolutionary new form of energy? Libby was excited. She knew this was a big story, and she was going to get to the bottom of it. Just then, Libby heard a crash from inside the building. Someone was in there. She went around the back and snuck in through a broken window. Inside, the whole place was a giant laboratory. And seated in a wheelchair in the middle of the lab was Dr. Enstein himself. And he was talking to an odd-looking robot that seemed to be a secretary. But what really amazed Libby was that the secretary robot was talking back. Dr. Enstein was angry.
No one steals the most brilliant invention in the history of mankind from me and gets away with it,
he thundered. After Libby had quietly phoned Jack Mackenzie, her boss, back at Channel 8, she snuck back to check on Dr. Enstein. The doc was yelling at the secretary robot, who was obviously pretty stupid. After chasing the stupid robot outside, Dr. Enstein returned to his equipment. He began to pull levers, press buttons, and switch switches. The machinery hummed into life. Libby looked on, unsure of what the crazy old coot was up to.
I, Dr. Maximilian Siegfried Enstein, genius and man, am now going to have a baby,
exclaimed the doctor. Libby watched as the doctor's machine started producing bits and pieces of a person. A leg, an arm, a head, a foot. It was amazing. Libby was concentrating so hard on Dr. Enstein that she didn't notice the secretary robot sneak up behind her. The robot shoved Libby into the lab. Dr. Enstein was furious to find someone spying on his top-secret work. Libby knew she was in danger, so she quickly made up a story. She claimed she was a lab assistant whose father had worked for the Atlantic Corporation. Libby then told Dr. Enstein that her father had said he was a genius.
I am, and I'm not surprised your father knew my name either,
crowed the vain inventor. By now, Dr. Enstein had put all the pieces together on a lab bench. The pieces formed a person, sort of. Libby's flattery worked, and the doctor allowed her to stay as he brought his creation to life. The doctor boasted about his creature, or as he called it, his son. He would possess the strength of 10 men and an IQ of 250. He would be pain-resistant, rust-proof, and obedient to the doctor's every command. Enstein was planning to use the creature to get back the plans stolen by the Atlantic Corporation. The doctor made the final adjustments and then switched on the Energizer ray above the bench.
Rise, my son,
ordered the doctor. And to Libby's amazement, the creature began to sit up. Dr. Enstein's experiment had worked. As the creature looked around, the doctor named him Frank. Frank Enstein. Dr. Enstein was thrilled. It seemed as if his creation was everything he had planned. Until he asked Frank to walk. Even though he was supposed to have an IQ of 250, Frank didn't really know how to walk. First, he put his left leg forward, then he fell over. Next, he put his right leg forward and fell over. Finally, he put both legs forward at the same time and fell over. Dr. Enstein was furious.
Stupid, stupid!
He yelled at poor Frank. Enraged, Dr. Enstein ranted and raved, but Frank just couldn't get the hang of walking. Libby didn't like the way Dr. Enstein was treating his son, so she decided to distract him by asking about the invention that was stolen by the Atlantic Corporation. The doctor proudly explained he had made the greatest discovery in scientific history, the secret to perpetual motion. Thanks to Dr. Enstein, the world would never again have energy problems, and the doctor knew this would make him the most powerful man on Earth. Unfortunately, Frank interrupted the doctor.
I love you, Dad.
That was enough for Dr. Enstein. He started rewiring Frank and replacing his microchips. Anything to make his son a little smarter. Dr. Enstein started mocking Frank because he spoke slowly and couldn't walk. Libby didn't like to see him being unkind to Frank, so when the doctor left the lab, she walked over to Frank and started talking to him. She told him that his dad was being mean and that she thought he was doing okay. This made Frank happy.
I'm okay, Frank. Okay, Frankenstein,
he said. When Libby started giggling, Frank didn't understand what she was doing. So Libby explained about feeling happy and caring for people. She told Frank about love. But Libby hadn't forgotten her job as a television news researcher. So while Dr. Enstein was out of the lab, she used her mobile phone to call Jack Mackenzie at Channel 8. She started to tell him about Dr. Enstein's amazing creation. But before she could finish, Enstein burst back into the lab. Libby quickly hung up and put the phone in her handbag. Dr. Enstein replaced some of Frank's microchips and ordered him to go straight to the Atlantic Corporation.
Your mission, my son, is to bring my secret formula back home where it belongs,
he ordered. Just then, Libby's mobile phone started ringing. Dr. Enstein grabbed it and heard that the call was from Channel 8, and he realized Libby was spying on him. The doctor threatened to break her neck unless she acted as if everything was completely normal. So Libby told her boss that there wasn't really any story at the Enstein building and that she was going to do a bit of shopping and then head home. Jack Mackenzie, Libby's boss at Channel 8, was no fool. He knew Libby sounded funny, so he called his ace reporter, Scoop Bishop.
Newsroom to Scoop.
This is Jack. Come in.
He said. Jack asked Scoop to check that Libby was okay, so the reporter headed out to the Enstein building. Meanwhile, Dr. Enstein was deciding what to do with Libby. Dr. Enstein made up his mind. He ordered Frank to strangle Libby. But Frank was confused.
I like Libby, Dad.
He explained. Evil Dr. Enstein didn't care what Frank liked or didn't like. Once again, he ordered Frank to strangle Libby. When Frank didn't obey, Dr. Enstein reached for the remote control. By using the remote, the doctor could send orders directly into Frank's brain, and Frank had no choice but to obey him. The big creature lurched towards a terrified Libby. But just then, Dr. Enstein heard a car pull up outside the building. He quickly turned off the lights and ordered Frank to keep Libby quiet. The car belonged to ace reporter Scoop Bishop. Outside the darkened Enstein building, Scoop took a look around. There didn't seem to be any sign of life. In fact, the place looked totally abandoned. Meanwhile, upstairs, Libby was trying to yell for help, but Frank wouldn't let her. He was a little confused, but he wanted to make his dad happy, so he followed orders and kept Libby quiet. Eventually, Scoop drove away. Dr. Enstein turned the lights back on and ordered Frank to tie up Libby. He wasn't going to kill her. Yet. Frank headed off on his mission to the Atlantic Organization, but instead of saying goodbye, he said hello. Dr. Enstein was furious.
Goodbye. It's goodbye.
He barked. And so Frank lurched out of the laboratory. Actually, because he didn't know how to open the door, he walked right through it. Frank lumbered down the road past all the houses. It was morning by now, and small children were eating their breakfast. One of them, a boy called Joshua, saw Frank outside the kitchen window.
Ah! Boogeyman!
He cried. Joshua's mother didn't believe him until she turned around and saw Frank for herself, and then she fainted. Meanwhile, no one had heard from Libby. Back at Channel 8, Scoop and Libby's boss, Jack, were trying to figure out where she was. Finally, Jack figured there must be something seriously wrong, so he decided to call the police. Frank was still searching for the Atlantic Corporation headquarters. He stumbled across a golf course and annoyed the golfers by eating their ball, and then he stomped across a freeway and nearly caused a bad accident. Back in the laboratory, Libby was trying to convince Dr. Enstein that she wasn't really spying on him. She told him today was the day the Atlantic Corporation was going to make a big announcement about a revolutionary new car. But Dr. Enstein didn't believe her.
Why don't you see for yourself? The morning news should be on about now,
said the quick-thinking Libby. So the doctor turned on the TV and saw the news story about Atlantic. Now he began to believe Libby. Just then, Frank arrived at Atlantic Corporation headquarters. There were lots of people waiting around for the announcement about the car, and Frank wasn't too sure of what to do. But he was trying really hard to complete his mission.
I am on a mission from Dad. I will not fail you, Dad,
he said to himself. Finally, Frank found what he thought he was looking for, the top-secret computer room. Instead of knocking on the door, Frank just walked through it. There were rows and rows of files, but only one of them was labeled Enstein. Frank knew that was his name, so he took the file. Outside, the Atlantic Corporation bosses announced just what was so revolutionary about their new car. It was powered by water. When Frank emerged from the building, they thought he was the car's test driver, so they gave him the keys. Frank Enstein got into the water-powered car and simply drove it away. The car was worth at least $1 billion, so the Atlantic Corporation bosses were furious. Every policeman in the city started searching for Frank Enstein and the car. Even the army was called in. As he drove down the freeway, all the fuss was making Frank nervous.
Uh-oh, I want my dad.
He wailed. Meanwhile, back at the lab, Dr. Enstein forced Libby to phone Jack Mackenzie, her boss at Channel 8. The crazy doctor snatched away her phone and yelled at Jack. He demanded that the police and army hunt for Frank be called off, or else Libby Jansen would be killed. Meanwhile, Frank was driving down the freeway. He'd been spotted by the army helicopters, and now a swarm of them was following his car. The noise was making Frank very nervous. When he switched on his inbuilt radio receiver to block out the sound, Frank heard a news report on him. The report mentioned Dr. Enstein was threatening to kill Libby. Frank didn't like that.
I like Libby. She is my friend. Bad dad. No.
He stated. Frank was so angry, he crashed the billion-dollar car. It exploded in a ball of flame and was destroyed. But Frank didn't even care. He stomped off towards the laboratory, intent now on rescuing Libby. The army helicopters were still following Frank, and the pilots wanted to blast him with their missiles. But Jack Mackenzie knew if Frank was hurt, then Dr. Enstein would kill Libby. So he asked the army generals not to fire. So the helicopters backed off, and Frank stomped his way back towards the laboratory. The only person following him now was ace reporter Scoop Bishop. When Frank finally arrived back at the lab, Dr. Enstein only wanted his computer files.
Now hand over the file like a good boy,
he ordered. But before Frank could do it, Scoop Bishop snatched the file from him. Dr. Enstein ordered Frank to take the file back, but Frank wouldn't do it. So the doctor commanded the stupid secretary robot to get Scoop. She started chasing the reporter around the lab. Seizing her chance, Libby snatched the robot remote control out of Dr. Enstein's hands and gave his wheelchair a big shove down the stairs. Realizing that Frank had returned to the lab to help her, Libby decided to help Frank by reprogramming him. So, when Dr. Enstein returned with an axe and ordered Frank to kill Libby, he replied,
Libby has reprogrammed me. I do not kill.
Well, the doctor was furious. He swung the axe, but Frank grabbed it and pushed Dr. Enstein away. Of course, Frank was very strong, and the doctor's wheelchair smashed into the laboratory equipment. It bounced high in the air and threw the doctor onto the lab bench underneath the big Energizer ray. The wheelchair had managed to press some of the wrong buttons, and the equipment started to spark and flash, and in no time, a small fire started. Not only that, the fire somehow activated the energy beam, while Dr. Enstein was right underneath it. The beam glowed into life. Libby couldn't believe her eyes.
Frank, what's happening?
She cried. Just outside the lab, the secretary robot was still trying to take the computer file from Scoop. They wrestled around on the floor, and finally Scoop cried,
Stop! Let me up!
And the robot immediately did just that. She had been programmed to obey human commands. Meanwhile, Libby and Frank watched in amazement as the energy beam began to transform Dr. Enstein. He appeared to glow brightly, and then disappeared in a bright flash of light. When the light died down, Dr. Enstein had disappeared, and in his place, there was a baby. A happy, smiling, and completely harmless baby. Now, the flames were really taking hold of the laboratory, so Frank, the secretary robot, Scoop, and Libby, who was carrying the baby Dr. Enstein, all ran down the stairs. They raced out of the building and across the car park. By now, police cars and fire engines had arrived, but it was too late. The Enstein building was fully ablaze.
Take cover, everyone! It's all gonna go!
Warned the fire chief. And just as they all dived out of the way, the entire building blew up, leaving just a pile of smoldering rubble. The next day, in the Channel 8 newsroom, Jack, Scoop, and Libby talked about what to do. They knew they could tell the story of the computer file being stolen and then recovered by ace reporter Scoop Bishop, but who would ever believe Dr. Enstein had created life? And who would believe he'd been turned into a baby?
We'd be laughed off the airwaves if we told the rest of it.
Stated Scoop. Jack and Libby knew he was right, so they decided to bury the story. Libby went home to find Frank playing with the baby Dr. Enstein. She wasn't sure how it was going to work out, but the three of them would live together and form a family. Sort of.
Thus another fine wizard tale concludes. Sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, join me again soon for another classic tale. Won't you?